That night, I made dinner for one. I had planned for two. I'd bought smoked sausage at the co-op on Elm Street because Ruth likes it. Liked it. I don't know how to conjugate that anymore. And left the pot on the stove while I waited for her to answer the text I sent at 6:30. She didn't answer. I sent another one at 6:50, shorter, with a period at the end that didn't need to be there. Ruth said later that period was what decided everything. I told her she was being dramatic. That was the last thing I said before she hung up. I ate alone at 7:20. The sausage turned out great anyway, which annoyed me. I don't remember exactly what time I heard the sound for the first time. It must have been close to 10. I was in the living room, the TV on something I wasn't really watching, when a noise came from the backyard. A scraping sound like something heavy had dragged against the wooden fence that separates my side from the field. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out. The yard was dark, the way it always gets after 9 when the streetlight doesn't reach the corner near the trees. I didn't see anything. I heard the wind moving through the conifers out back and figured that was it. I went back to the couch. I didn't think about the sound again that night. Here's the problem with that. I should have. I've lived in the Birchwood complex for 11 years. 6 townhouse units on a long lot, garden out front and a utility area out back. And past the utility area there's the fence. And past the fence there's a tree line about 40 feet tall that nobody planted on purpose. They grew up after the field was abandoned. There was a development project slated for that land, but nobody ever moved it forward, and the place just kept getting more and more overgrown. I know every sound this place makes. I know the squeak of the side gate when the wind comes from the north. I know the sound of the washing machines in Unit 3 on early Tuesday mornings. I know the difference between snow hitting the metal roof of the utility shed and snow hitting the trees out back. I've worked transmission line maintenance for 19 years. I get paid to hear what's not right. The sound that night wasn't the gate. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. But I was angry at Ruth. And when I'm angry, I pull the perimeter tight around myself and don't let anything else in. It's a bad habit. My ex-wife used to call it emotional bunker mode. She wasn't wrong. I went to bed around midnight. Before I turned off the light, I spent a couple of minutes staring at the ceiling, wondering if I should call Ruth and apologize. I decided not to, because she'd hung up on me, and that felt like enough reason to put it off. So I put it off. I turned off the light. The next morning I left for work at 6:30. I had a scheduled inspection at 2 distribution points on the east side of the county and picked up the company truck from the yard. I didn't go through the back of my unit before I left. If I had, I would have seen the marks on the fence sooner. I saw them on the way back at 4 in the afternoon, while the light was still good. The wooden fence separating my utility area from the field stands about 6 feet tall. The boards are old, half-rotted at the base, and I'd already asked the building manager to replace at least the 3 on the right side. He never did. That afternoon, when I went to throw out the trash, I noticed the middle board had a mark that hadn't been there before. A pressure running top down, like something had rested its weight on it from the other side, getting ready to come over. The wood hadn't snapped, but it had buckled. The mark was wide, wider than anything I could put a name to. I stood there looking at it for a stretch of time I couldn't measure. Then I thought, animal. Deer, maybe. They come out of the field sometimes in winter when the grass disappears. But deer don't rest their weight like that. Deer jump. This wasn't the momentum of a leap. This was weight applied with care. I went inside, washed my hands, picked up my phone to call Ruth and stood there holding it for about 10 minutes without dialing. I didn't call. I need that to be clear, because it's going to matter later. I had 2 things to deal with that afternoon, and I dealt with neither. I didn't properly look into the fence. I didn't call Ruth. I did what I do when I don't want to face something. I straightened up the kitchen, which was already clean, and watched an episode of some show I can't even remember now. That night the sound came back. This time I was awake. It was close to 11:30 and I'd gone to the kitchen for water when I heard it. Not from the fence this time, but closer. From the utility area. A low sound, almost like breathing I would have said back then, but too thick to be breathing from anything small. I stood still in the middle of the kitchen with the glass of water in my hand and waited. The sound stopped. I moved to the window slowly, without turning on the light. I looked out at the yard. The utility area sits about 25 feet from the kitchen window, and that night, there was a thin layer of snow on the ground, the granular kind that looks like coarse salt. Nothing was moving, but there was a shadow in the right-hand corner near the basement door that wasn't the shadow of a tree or a trash bin. It was too long, and it was in the wrong place for the direction of the light. I stood there watching for maybe a minute. The shadow didn't move. I went to bed with the kitchen light on, which I never do. I didn't think of it as being scared. I thought of it as being cautious. There's a difference, but that night I wasn't sure which one was actually true. I still hadn't called Ruth. I woke up at 5:40 with the kitchen light still on, and that feeling of having slept wrong. Not badly, just off. The way your body knows it was standing watch even with your eyes closed. I went to the window before making coffee. Force of habit from work. You arrive at a location, first you assess the perimeter. The yard was quiet. The granular snow from the night before had hardened into that crunched styrofoam texture. I couldn't see any new marks from that distance, but the morning light was still low and the corner near the basement door stayed in shadow until close to 8. I made coffee, ate toast standing up looking out the window. That's when the thought came in, simple and direct, the way practical thoughts do. Someone was trying to get into my house. I don't know why it took me until the next morning to get there. Maybe because night scrambles logic and morning puts it back in order. The sequence made sense. Pressure mark on the fence, sound in the utility area, shadow near the basement door. 3 points make a line. Someone was scoping out the back of the property. Someone was checking the access. Homes with backlots are targets. I knew that in the abstract way you know things you've never had to use. I remembered reading something about it years back. An article maybe, or a conversation at work, I couldn't say, about how backyards with no street visibility are the preferred entry points. Side gate, utility area, basement door. You live somewhere with those features and there's a structural vulnerability most people ignore, because they've never had to think about it. I'd never had to think about it. 11 years at Birchwood, and the biggest threat I'd faced was the building manager trying to raise the HOA fee without notice. I lived here. I took out the trash, hung laundry in the utility area when the summer let me, went down to the basement to grab the tools I keep stored there. The back of the property was just the back of the property. The fence was just old wood. The trees out back were just trees. You live your life in a place until the place changes its meaning. And when it changes fast. That morning I replaced the lock on the back door. I have tools. I know what I'm doing. It took 40 minutes. Then I went to the basement door, which is outside on the side of the utility area, accessed by a concrete stairwell that drops about 6 feet, and checked the padlock. It was intact. I ran my hand over the doorwood, the hinges. Nothing forced. I got to work later than planned, and spent the whole day with it sitting in the back of my head in a way that annoyed me, because it wasn't my style. I'm a field technician. I identify the problem, isolate the cause, fix it. Here I had signals without a confirmed cause, and that put me in a state I couldn't quite name. It wasn't exactly fear. It was more like working with equipment giving you inconsistent readings. You don't trust it. You keep watching. I called Ruth on my lunch break. She didn't pick up. I sent a text saying I needed to talk, that I'd been harsh, that the period at the end of that message didn't need to be there. She read it. The app shows when someone reads it, and didn't reply. I sat there staring at that red notification longer than I should have, eating a sandwich inside the parked truck. I got home at 5. Still light out. Vermont sun in early March lasts longer than you'd think but disappears all at once. No warning. I went straight to the back before going inside. There were new marks in the snow, not on the fence. In the snow in the yard, near the trash bin, about 10 feet from the back door I'd just rekeyed. The marks weren't from boots. They were wide, irregular, with a spacing between them that didn't match any animal I could connect to that size. I crouched down and looked closely. The granular snow held the shape with precision. I could see the pressure, the weight distribution, the depth. Whoever this was, they were heavy. Heavier than anyone I knew. I took a photo with my phone. Not entirely sure why. Documentation instinct, I think. I do the same thing at work when I find equipment failure before calling in the crew. I went inside, locked the new door, went to the kitchen window and stood there looking at the yard until it got dark. The intruder theory was still there, but it had gotten a little smaller. Not because the signs had let up, but because the marks in the snow didn't make sense for a human being. The spacing between them was too wide. The depth was too much. And there was something about the weight distribution that suggested a way of moving. I couldn't fit to any human shape, no matter how large. It didn't fit anything I was ready to name yet. I ate dinner without an appetite. That smoked sausage was still in the fridge, left over from the night of the fight with Ruth, and I hadn't been able to throw it out, which was stupid, because sausage doesn't last a week in the fridge and I knew that. I threw it out that night. Made an omelet instead. At 10:30 I heard the sound again. This time it wasn't breathing. It was something else, a weight moving slowly through the utility area, the way someone walks when they're trying to be quiet but they're too big to pull it off. The utility area has a bare concrete floor, and the sound coming from out there had a different quality than the night before. Closer. Slower. I went to the window in the dark. There was something standing in the utility area. I didn't see the full shape. The streetlight caught the left side of the yard and left the right side, where the thing was, in almost total shadow. I saw height. I saw it was upright. I saw that it was wide across the shoulders, in a way that didn't fit any human silhouette I'd ever seen. It stood there for maybe 30 seconds. Then it stepped back into the shadow and was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with all the lights off and my eyes on the window until 4 in the morning, when exhaustion finally outweighed everything else. The next morning, before anything else, I checked my phone. Ruth still hadn't answered. There's a difference between knowing something is happening and accepting the size of what is happening. I spent the next day entirely inside that difference. I woke up at 6 with my head heavy in that specific way of someone who didn't really sleep. Not pain, just a thickness behind the eyes that makes everything run slightly slower. I went to the window. Yard empty. The snow in the utility area was trampled in a way that looked almost mundane in daylight, almost explainable. Almost. I didn't go to work. I called my supervisor and said I had a fever. I didn't. But I needed to stay home, and there was no way to explain why that would have sounded reasonable to anyone else. So I lied, and the lie came out easy, which told me something about the state I was in. I spent the morning doing what I do when I need to understand a problem. I documented everything. I grabbed a notebook I use for field notes and wrote it all out in order. The night of the fight with Ruth. The sound at the fence. The marks on the board. The shadow near the basement door. The marks in the granular snow in the yard. The silhouette in the utility area. I wrote with the same precision I use at work. Times, locations, physical characteristics of what I'd observed. When I finished, I looked at the page and the problem became clearer and uglier at the same time. There was a pattern. Each night the thing had come a little closer. Night 1, the fence about 40 feet from the house. Night 2, the utility area about 25 feet. Night 3, standing in the yard, less than 15 feet from the kitchen window. This wasn't random behavior. This was systematic approach. And systematic approach means learning. It means something was assessing the terrain, testing the limits, measuring the response, or the absence of one. I closed the notebook and sat at the table for a considerable stretch of time without thinking about anything specific, which is what happens to me when something is too large to process head-on. Then I called Ruth. She picked up this time. Picked up after 3 rings with a voice I recognized, the voice of someone who'd been waiting but wouldn't admit they'd been waiting. She said, "Hey." I said, "Hey." There was a silence of maybe 5 seconds that weighed more than the entire conversation that followed. I apologized. I told her the period didn't need to be there, and that I'd known that while I was typing it, and sent it anyway, which made it worse. Ruth was quiet for a moment and then said she knew I'd apologize eventually, that with me it was always just a matter of time, and she didn't say it with anger. She said it with a tiredness that landed differently than anger would have. Tiredness is harder to answer than anger. We talked for 20 minutes. We didn't actually resolve anything, but it got lighter. Before we hung up, Ruth asked if I was okay because my voice sounded off. I said I was tired. She accepted that. I didn't say anything about the yard. I'm not entirely sure why. Partly because it would have sounded ridiculous out loud. Partly because I still didn't have a name for what was happening. In the afternoon, I went to inspect the backyard while the light was still good. The marks in the snow had frozen overnight and held their shape with a clarity I would have preferred not to have. I crouched next to each one and measured with the tape measure I keep in my work jacket. The largest was about 13 inches long, wide with 4 distinct pressure points at the front. Not human fingers, but a distribution that resembled fingers, resembled phalangeal pressure, just larger, with a spacing that didn't match any human hand. And there were marks from something sharp along the edges. Not deep, just a light scratch in the snow crust, like a claw grazing the surface without pressing down. I stood there looking at that for a long time. Then I looked at the basement door. The basement door sits flush with the ground, accessed by that concrete stairwell that drops about 6 feet. It's an old door, heavy wood with a metal reinforcement, and the padlock I use down there is a good one, the kind made from hardened steel that doesn't give easy. I went down the stairs and checked. The padlock was intact, the doorwood was intact. But there was a mark on the concrete lip of the stairwell, a pressure mark, the same kind of depression I'd seen on the fence board, as if something had rested its weight there, on the top edge of the stairs, looking down. The stairwell is about 2 feet wide. The pressure mark took up nearly the full width. I climbed back up to the yard and locked the utility area with the padlock I use on the steel laundry room door. It wasn't going to solve anything. The service door is weaker than the padlock, but doing something was better than standing still. That night I didn't hear anything until close to midnight. I was awake, of course, sitting in the kitchen again, in the dark, with coffee that had gone cold in the mug. And when the sound came, it wasn't from the utility area. It was from below. It was from the basement, not the sound of a break-in, not wood splintering or metal being forced. It was the sound of presence, the kind of sound an enclosed space makes when there's something large inside it that shouldn't be there. A displacement of air, a weight shifting, and underneath that, very low, almost at the edge of what I could hear, breathing. I went completely still. The breathing lasted maybe 40 seconds. Then it stopped. Then the silence of the basement went back to being normal silence. I didn't go down. I didn't go check. I sat in the kitchen with my hands around the cold mug until 2 in the morning, thinking about something I didn't want to think about. The padlock on the basement door had been intact. I'd checked it that afternoon. The door had been intact. Whatever I'd just heard was already inside, and I had no idea how long it had been there. I didn't go down to the basement that morning. I didn't go down the next morning either. That needs to be said because it says something about the state I was in. Not exactly cowardice, but a specific paralysis I'd never experienced before and didn't recognize as paralysis while I was inside it. I called it caution. I called it strategy. I kept going to work, kept making coffee at 6, kept exchanging texts with Ruth that were getting longer and closer than they'd been in months. I was functioning. I just wasn't going down to the basement. On the 3rd day, Gary Phelps asked me what was wrong. Gary has worked with me for 7 years. He's the kind of man who doesn't ask questions out of politeness. When he asks, it's because he noticed something and decided the discomfort of the conversation was worth it. We were on break, him with his coffee, me with mine, and he said, "You've been different this week." He didn't ask what it was. He just stated it. I told him I was having trouble sleeping. He accepted that and didn't push. But he held his eyes on me for 1 beat longer than necessary. The way people do when they know the explanation they've been given is technically true and substantially incomplete. What I didn't tell Gary, what I didn't tell anyone, was that I'd started noticing something beyond the physical signs. I'd started noticing my own habits. I wake up every day at 5:50 without an alarm, as far back as I can remember. I make coffee, stay in the kitchen for 20 minutes, then go to the bathroom, then get dressed. I leave through the front door at 6:40 every day. I'm back between 4:30 and 5:30 depending on the day. Sometimes I go out again at night to pick something up at the co-op, which closes at 9. I leave around 7:30, get back around 8:20. Lights out at 10:30. None of those times were written down anywhere. But they were real, consistent, and I'd been following them for years without thinking about it. Because that's what routine is. You stop seeing what you're doing because you're always doing the same thing. The problem was that something else had also stopped seeing. It had learned. I realized it when I woke up Thursday at 5:40 and went to the window out of habit, and the yard was quiet, and I thought, of course it's quiet. There's still 20 minutes before I open the kitchen window, and then I understood what I had just thought. I stood in the middle of the bedroom as that idea opened up inside me in an uncomfortable way. It wasn't a thing testing the perimeter anymore. It was a thing that had learned the perimeter. It had learned when I was in the kitchen, when I left, when I came back, when the lights went out. It had learned, and it was using that knowledge to get closer without being seen, to pull back before I went to the window, to be present in the gaps between my presences. I thought about work, involuntarily. I thought about the way transmission lines fail. Not all at once, not with noise, but through erosion. Point by point, the structure looks intact right up until it isn't anymore. That afternoon I did something I hadn't done since I was younger, and living in a neighborhood that demanded more attention. I changed my routine on purpose. I left later than usual, came back a different way, went in through the front door instead of the side. I didn't turn on the kitchen light at the usual time. I stayed in the bedroom with the reading lamp which faces the front of the house. I didn't go to the back window until 11. The yard was empty at 11. I watched for 10 minutes. Nothing. I went back to the bedroom, turned off the light, and waited. At 11:42, I know the time because I checked my phone. I heard the sound in the utility area. The same wait, the same slow movement. It had arrived almost an hour later than the pattern from the previous nights. It had noticed the change, and it had adjusted. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and stayed with that for a long time. Not the fear. The fear was almost familiar by then, had settled in like constant background noise. What occupied me was something else. A question I didn't want to put into words, but that was there anyway, clear and without mercy. If it learns, what else is it capable of? Ruth texted me at 11:58 asking if I was awake. I said yes. She asked if she could call. I said yes again. We were on the phone for 40 minutes. Ruth talked about her job, about a coworker who was being difficult, about a movie she'd watched alone on Wednesday that she'd liked more than she expected. I listened and responded, and while I did, there was a part of me at the window, in the yard, fixed on the sound that had stopped out there and that I couldn't pinpoint precisely. Whether it was still in the utility area or had gone back to the trees or was somewhere else I hadn't yet learned to monitor. Before we hung up, Ruth said she was glad we'd been talking. She said she'd missed me in that direct voice she has when she decides to be honest and stops protecting herself. I said I'd missed her too. It was true. After she hung up, the silence of the apartment took on a different quality. It wasn't the silence from before. The silence of a house I knew completely. Every creak, every pattern. It was the silence of a place that had been studied from the outside in by something I still couldn't name, with a patience that didn't fit any animal I knew, and that wasn't human intelligence, but was something else. Some kind of learning that worked through repetition and presence and time. I went to bed at 2 in the morning. Before I closed my eyes, I thought about the basement. I thought about the intact padlock and the sound of breathing that had come from down there 3 nights before. I thought about how long the basement door stayed unlocked when I went down to get tools. I thought about how many times a week I went down, at what times, how regularly. I thought about how much of that it already knew. On Friday night, the basement heater stopped working. I know the exact time because the utility company app sent an alert to my phone at 10:17. I have the system connected because I'm a technician and because it's the kind of thing I do. I monitor equipment. It's automatic. The alert said fault in thermostat of lower heating unit, basement temperature dropping. I have tools stored down there. I also have a box of documents, my backup work PPE, and 3 water jugs I keep out of habit since a winter years back when we went 4 days without water service. If the temperature dropped below freezing, the jugs would freeze and crack. Small loss, objectively. But my pragmatic brain ran the calculation before the rest of me could step in. I stared at the alert for maybe 2 minutes. Then I grabbed the big flashlight, the one I use in the field, and went. The basement door is outside, on the side of the utility area. 4 concrete steps down, opening into a space of about 400 square feet with a low ceiling, cinder block walls, concrete floor. There's a single overhead bulb I turn on with a switch on the wall, right at the entrance. It always smells like mildew and cold metal. In winter, when the heater's running, the smell of hot metal mixes with the mildew in a way I never found pleasant but learned to ignore. That night, when I opened the door, the smell was different. Not mildew, not metal. It was organic, dense, with a damp layer underneath, like the inside of a freezer that's been unplugged for days, except warmer, more alive. I stopped on the first step with the flashlight pointed inside, and the smell hit the back of my throat before I could process what it meant. I turned on the flashlight, swept the space, empty. The boxes where they should be, the tools where they should be, the jugs against the back wall intact. I went down all 4 steps. The heater is in the right-hand corner, an old wall unit the condo management never replaced because it still worked, or used to. I crossed to it with the flashlight and spotted the problem immediately. A loose wire in the back, probably accumulated vibration, the kind of simple failure I fix with a flathead screwdriver and 2 minutes of attention. I set the flashlight on the toolbox aimed at the heater and opened the box to get the screwdriver. That's when I heard the breathing. The goddamn breathing. It wasn't coming from far away. It was coming from the left corner of the basement, the corner behind the staircase where the flashlight beam didn't reach directly. Slow, heavy breathing, with a gap between the inhale and the exhale that was too long. Not the rhythm of something small, not the rhythm of anything I wanted behind me in a closed 400 square foot space with a 6-foot ceiling. I didn't turn around right away. That sounds impossible, but it's true. I stood there with the screwdriver in my hand for a moment I can't measure, because my body entered a state that wasn't decision. It was suspension, like when you're on a pole 25 feet up and your foot slips and your body stops everything before your brain has processed what happened. Then I turned around. It was in the left corner, partially behind the support column that splits the basement down the middle. The flashlight caught the right side of its torso and part of one arm, too long, with a joint at the elbow that bent at an angle no human arm bends. The fur was sparse, uneven, with patches of visible skin between the tufts, grayish, stretched over a frame that was wide at the shoulders and narrow in a way that didn't match any proportions I knew. The claws, I saw the claws because the arm was braced against the wall and the fingers were spread open against the cinder block. Each claw thick and dull, and long enough to leave a white mark in the block where it pressed. It didn't move. It stood there looking at me, and I couldn't fully see its eyes because the column was blocking part of its face. But what I could see reflected the flashlight beam in a way that made me flinch the light away by instinct. The way you flinch when you aim a flashlight at a mirror and the reflection catches you. I didn't scream. That also sounds impossible. But screaming requires the body to release something, and mine was completely locked. Shallow breathing, screwdriver in my right hand, flashlight in my left, 4 steps and an open door behind me that suddenly felt like they were in another city. It breathed. The sound filled the entire basement. My body decided before I did. 1 step back, then another. The flashlight never left it. I learned that at work, you never take your eyes off the risk point. You keep watching while you retreat. It didn't advance. It stayed in the corner with its arm against the wall, and that slow breathing that didn't speed up as I moved. I went up all 4 steps backward. The last step, the top one. My heel slipped on the wet concrete and I lost my balance sideways and hit my right shoulder against the stairwell wall, and the impact was enough to break the lock. I felt the pain, felt the cold of the concrete through my sleeve, and something in the circuit between my brain and my body reconnected. I got out, pulled the door shut. The padlock was in my left hand and I don't remember picking it up, but it was there. And I locked it with hands that were shaking in a way I can't describe better than this. Not shaking from cold, shaking like an overloaded electrical system, the kind that comes before failure. I went inside the apartment, locked the back door, locked the front door, walked to the middle of the living room and stopped. My phone was in my hand. There was a name on the screen. I'd started dialing without realizing it. Ruth. The call rang once before I understood what I was doing and hung up. It wasn't the right moment, or it was exactly the right moment and I didn't know what to say. I still don't know which one was true. I sat down on the living room floor with my back against the couch and stayed that way for a long time, flashlight still on in my hand, pointed at the ceiling, lighting up nothing. The basement heater was still broken. The jugs would freeze by morning. I thought about that. I thought about the water jugs freezing down there. With it, I don't know how long I stayed on the living room floor. At some point, the flashlight died. Battery, not my choice. And the apartment went dark except for the streetlight coming through the gaps in the blinds. I stayed that way anyway. I didn't get up to turn anything on. The dark felt more honest in that moment than any light I could have switched on. What I knew, it was in the basement. The basement was locked. The basement walls were cinder block and the door was heavy wood with metal reinforcement. But it was still wood, and I had seen what it did to the fence board without apparently trying. What I didn't know, how long it had been in there. Whether it had come in through the basement door at some point when I'd forgotten the padlock, or whether there was another entry I didn't know about. Some gap in the foundation, some blind spot that 11 years of living here hadn't taught me because I'd never needed to learn it. That second possibility was the one I couldn't stop running through my head. I got up around midnight. Not because I felt better, I felt exactly the same, but because staying on the floor had stopped making sense as a position. I went to the kitchen, turned on the small stove light I use when I don't want full brightness, and stood against the sink drinking water. My phone was on the counter. Ruth had texted at 11:42. I'd been on the floor when it came in and hadn't seen it. The message just said, "Asleep?" with a question mark. The kind of message that looks small and isn't. I didn't answer that night. In the morning, I went to work because not going required an explanation I didn't have. I took the truck, ran the route, exchanged 12 words with Gary on break. He looked at me the way he does but didn't ask anything this time. Sometimes people sense that the question will land somewhere nobody is ready to go. I got back at 4:40. Before going in, I walked to the side of the utility area and looked at the basement door from a distance from the gate. The padlock was in place. The door was shut. No new marks I could see from that distance. I went inside through the front. The day passed. The night passed. I didn't hear anything from the basement. That was almost worse, because when there was sound, I knew where it was. Silence didn't mean absence. I'd already learned that. Silence meant it was still, and still could mean anything. On the second day after the confrontation, I called the condo management and said there was moisture in the basement and I needed a plumber to check the foundation. It wasn't a complete lie. There was moisture, there always had been. The property manager said she'd schedule someone for the following week. I said I needed it sooner, that I was worried about documents I had stored down there. She said Thursday morning. Thursday was 4 days away. 4 days during which I needed to know if it was still down there without going down to check, and during which a plumber was going to go down without knowing what might be waiting. I called back and canceled. Said the problem had resolved itself. The property manager sounded mildly annoyed but didn't push. That night, Ruth called. I answered because not answering had a cost I wasn't willing to pay. She asked why I hadn't responded to her text 2 nights ago. I told her I'd gone to bed early. She was quiet for a second. That silence of hers that isn't empty, it's assessment. And then she said okay. We talked for half an hour. Ruth was excited about something at work, a project that had been approved after months of being stalled. And I could hear her voice get lighter as she talked about it, that specific way she has when something finally moves after being stuck for a long time. I knew that way. I'd missed it without realizing I'd been missing it. In the middle of the conversation, she said, "You seem more present today." I didn't answer right away. Then I said I was trying. She said she knew in a voice with no judgment in it at all, just recognition. And that was by far the hardest thing to hear that entire week. After she hung up, I went to the back window and looked at the yard for a while. Quiet. The basement door visible from there, the padlock a dark point against the wood. No movement. I went to bed at 11, which I hadn't done since before any of this started. It wasn't a conscious decision to reclaim routine. It was just the body hitting a limit and demanding. I slept for real, without waking, until 5:40. I woke up with a thought already formed, as if it had been assembled while I slept. If it was in the basement before I went down on Friday, it was down there while I sat in the kitchen in the middle of the night thinking I was monitoring the perimeter. It was right below my feet while I listened to sounds from the utility area outside, and concluded it was out there. It was down there while I replaced the lock on the back door, as if that was going to solve anything. The whole time I thought I was paying attention. I was paying attention to the wrong place. I got up, made coffee, went to the window. The basement door was open. Not broken open. Open. The padlock removed. The heavy wood pushed to the side, the concrete stairwell visible below, dark, with a rectangle of shadow at the bottom that showed nothing beyond shadow. The padlock was on the ground beside the stairs, intact, locked. The hasp on the wood not. The plate it had been anchored to had been torn outward, screws and splinters still attached to the metal. It hadn't broken in. It had pushed the door open from the inside, and the padlock had fallen with the impact. And the door had swung open, which meant the basement door opened from both sides, which meant the padlock had only ever blocked entry. It had never blocked exit. I stood there looking at that with my coffee going cold in my hand, and thought about every night I'd believed the padlock meant something. Every night I'd slept with that specific and completely false sense of security. I thought about calling Ruth and telling her everything. I held my phone for maybe 3 minutes. I didn't call. There was something I needed to deal with first, and it had nothing to do with Ruth, and I still didn't know how to deal with it. But I knew that until I did, it was better if Ruth stayed away from Birchwood. Away from me. The following Monday, Gary invited me out for a beer after work. It wasn't unusual. We did that sometimes, once a month maybe, without ritual or planning. One of us would suggest it and the other would accept or not. Simple as that. Normally I said no when I wasn't feeling it and he didn't take it personally. This time I said yes before thinking, which probably said more about my state than anything I could have put into words. We went to Perkins, which isn't a bar but has beer and stays open late, and neither of us needs atmosphere to have a conversation. Gary ordered a heady topper, and I ordered the same thing out of inertia, not really wanting it, and we spent the first 10 minutes talking about a transformer that had gone bad on the East Line, and about the new inspection protocol the supervisors wanted to implement that neither of us thought would hold up in practice. Then Gary went quiet for a moment and said, "So." He didn't ask anything, just said so. In that tone of his, that means the space is open if I want to use it. I looked at my beer. There was a small split in the paper coaster, the kind that shows up when moisture works through the fiber, and I sat there with my finger on it for no reason, while I thought about what I could say and what I couldn't say without sounding like someone who needed the kind of help Gary wasn't equipped to offer. I told him I'd been having trouble sleeping because of an animal. Gary waited. I said there was something in the back of the property, that it had been showing up at night, that I didn't really know what it was, but that it was large, and that it had scared me more than I expected. I used the word animal on purpose. It was the word that fit inside the space of a normal conversation between two normal people, in a place with fluorescent lighting and good beer. Gary asked if I'd called anyone. Animal control, a neighbor, anyone. I said no. He asked why, without judgment, just genuinely curious in that direct way he has. I didn't know how to answer right away. Then I said I wasn't sure what I was seeing, and that I didn't want to look stupid calling someone about something that might be smaller than it seemed. Gary nodded slowly, the way he does when he accepts an explanation but isn't completely sold on it. He ordered another beer. I still hadn't finished my first. We stayed another hour. We talked about other things. Gary's son, who was at college in Burlington and called in frequently, a trip he wanted to take to Maine in the summer because he'd never been. Normal things. I listened and participated, and there was a part of me doing it from a distance, like operating equipment by remote control while the main unit is somewhere else. On the way out, Gary stopped at the door and said, without looking directly at me, "If it's really a big animal, Diane, you don't have to deal with it alone." I didn't say anything. He didn't wait for an answer. He got in his truck and drove off. I drove back to Birchwood with that sentence taking up more space than it should have. I got there around 8:30. I went in through the front, turned on the lights, went to the kitchen for water. I dropped my jacket on the chair by the table, where I always drop it, years of habit, and went to the bathroom. When I came back to the kitchen, the jacket had fallen off the chair. I stood in the kitchen doorway looking at it on the floor. Jackets fall. I knew that. The chair back has an awkward angle and the jacket slides off when the weight isn't distributed right. It had happened before. But I stood there looking at it on the floor longer than I needed to, running the stupid involuntary calculation of whether I'd locked the front door or just pulled it shut, and whether I'd checked the kitchen window before leaving that morning, and whether the bedroom window was latched the way it always was. I picked up the jacket, put it back on the chair, went to check the windows, all latched, front door locked. Back door locked, and with the new deadbolt I'd installed 3 days earlier, a steel bolt I'd bought at the hardware store on Main Street, and installed myself in 40 minutes one afternoon when I needed to do something with my hands to stop thinking. Everything in place. I went to the kitchen window and looked out at the yard. Quiet. The basement door was shut. I'd shut it that morning, no padlock because the padlock was useless, and I saw no reason to keep pretending it wasn't. Just shut. I stood there for a while and then I realized I was hearing something, not from the yard, from above. Birchwood has 6 units and mine is on the ground floor. Unit 2, directly above me, belongs to a man named Dennis Albrecht, mid-60s, retired, who spends most of his time at home and who walks with a heavy tread that I hear through the ceiling at certain hours. I knew Dennis's footstep pattern. 2 years of that creates an involuntary map. What I was hearing wasn't Dennis. It was slower, heavier, with a spacing between steps that was too wide for any person I could picture walking around in Dennis's apartment. And there was something about the quality of the sound, a pressure coming up through my kitchen ceiling, that was different from the sound a wood floor makes when human weight walks across it. It was the sound a floor makes when it's close to its limit. I picked up my phone, stood there holding it without dialing. I thought about Dennis. I thought about the last time I'd seen Dennis. 2 days ago, maybe 3, in the hallway, him with a grocery bag, me heading out to work, 30 seconds of conversation about how the weather had been closing in. I thought about calling his apartment. I didn't have his number. I went to the front door and opened it. The hallway was quiet. I went up the stairs, 8 steps. Birchwood has a mezzanine level, not a full second floor, and walked to the door of Unit 2. I knocked. Silence. I knocked again, harder. The door to Unit 2 opened and Dennis Albrecht appeared holding a mug of tea with a mildly surprised expression. Behind him I could see the TV on, the armchair with the folded blanket over the arm, everything exactly the way it always was. He asked if everything was okay. I said yes. I said I thought I'd heard a strange noise and wanted to make sure he was all right. Dennis said he was fine, that he'd been quiet all evening, that he hadn't done anything but watch television since dinner. I walked back down the stairs with that information and went into my apartment and closed the door and stood with my back against it for a moment. Dennis was home. Dennis was fine. Dennis hadn't moved. What I'd heard in my kitchen ceiling wasn't Dennis. I didn't sleep in the apartment that night. I grabbed what I needed in 10 minutes. 2 days of clothes, my charger, the important documents from the desk drawer, not the ones in the basement, those I left, and went to my car. I had no plan. I drove to the Perkins parking lot, which stays open all night, reclined the seat, and stayed that way until 4 in the morning when the cold inside the car got stronger than the exhaustion, and I started the engine to warm up. At 6, I went straight to work from the parking lot. Gary saw me show up in yesterday's clothes and said nothing. That was an act of generosity I didn't know how to appreciate at the time. I spent the day in the field, which helped. There's a specific quality to maintenance work at height that doesn't leave room for anything else. You're 25 feet up a pole with a north wind and your thoughts stay entirely on what's in front of you because the alternative is falling. I needed that. I needed something that demanded everything. On my lunch break, I called Ruth. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting, which meant she'd noticed something was wrong, even though I hadn't said anything directly. Ruth has that ability, which always unsettled me a little and which I received that day as pure relief. I said I needed a favor. She asked what. I told her I needed her not to come to Birchwood for the next few days, not to try to visit, that if she wanted to talk, it should be by phone. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Not the assessment silence, this was different, more tense, and asked if I was in danger. I didn't answer right away. She said my name, Diane, with that specific weight a name takes on when the right person says it the right way. I told her I was dealing with something, and that I'd explain when I could and that I needed her to trust me for now. Ruth said she trusted me, in a voice that had fear inside it but held the fear in place, and that cost me something I still haven't been able to name right. I hung up and sat in the truck longer than my break allowed. That afternoon, back at work, I made a decision I hadn't planned on making. Or maybe I had planned it without admitting it to myself, because when the idea came, it didn't feel new. It felt like it had been waiting to be acknowledged. I was going back to Birchwood that night. I was going in. I was going to find out where it was. Not because it was brave, because it was the one move I hadn't made yet, and every other move had left me in exactly the same place, awake at 4 a.m. in a restaurant parking lot, in yesterday's clothes, with no answers. A field tech learned something early on. When you don't know what's failing, you don't stay away from the problem. You go to it with the right equipment and you look closely. I stopped at the hardware store on the way back, bought a headlamp with fresh batteries, electrical tape, and a can of pepper spray that was sitting on a shelf near the register between paint scrapers and lubricant. I don't know what I expected the spray to do. I bought it anyway. I got to Birchwood at 6:30 with enough light left to see the yard from the kitchen window before dark. I went in through the front. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Nothing out of place, nothing different. The air still with that specific smell of a place that's been closed up for a day. I made coffee, sat at the table, waited for dark. At 7:50 I heard Dennis moving in the apartment above, that heavy, familiar tread, the TV coming on, the sound of the shower he ran later on cold nights. Dennis. Normal. Real. At 8:40 the apartment was silent except for the wind outside. At 9:12 I heard the first sign, not from the basement, from the utility area. That slow, shifting weight I already knew, but different this time, faster, less careful. As if the pattern had changed, as if the patience it had shown over the previous weeks had reached a limit I didn't know existed. I got up, put on the headlamp, went to the back door. I opened it. The cold came in first. Vermont in March at night has a dry cold that bites the nostrils and makes your eyes water. I stood in the doorway with the headlamp sweeping the utility area. Empty. But the smell was there. That dense organic smell I'd first caught at the basement door on Friday, except stronger now, more present, as if the source was nearby and moving. I stepped outside. It came out from behind the trash bin. It didn't run. It didn't charge straight at me. It came out slowly, upright, and stopped about 12 feet away, and that height, which the open air made even more impossible to process than it had been in the basement. In the basement, the low ceiling created a scale. Out here, there was no ceiling. Out here, it was simply what it was, nothing above it, nothing to put the size in perspective. The headlamp caught its torso, part of its neck, the side of its face. The fur was sparse and uneven like before, with those patches of grayish skin visible between the tufts. But what I hadn't seen in the basement, because the big flashlight had been at a bad angle, was its face up close. The snout was elongated, but there was something in the bone structure underneath that wasn't entirely animal. There was a geometry that recalled something human, without being human, like a familiar proportion distorted to the point where recognition becomes discomfort. It looked at me. Its eyes reflected the headlamp beam in a way that made me flinch my head slightly by instinct. And in that second, I redirected the light it moved. Not a leap, a long, fast step that covered 6 feet before I processed the motion. And I stepped back inside and threw my shoulder into the door and threw the steel deadbolt with one hand, while the other still held the useless pepper spray. It hit the door once only, The impact traveled through the wood and the wall and reached my chest as physical pressure, not as sound. The steel deadbolt held. Then silence. I stood with my back against the door for a stretch of time I couldn't measure, breathing through my mouth because my nose had shut down from the cold and the shock. The pepper spray was crushed in my hand from squeezing it so hard. Then I went to the table, sat down, picked up my phone. This time I dialed without hesitating. Ruth picked up on the first ring. She picked up and I didn't say anything for about 3 seconds. Ruth waited. She has that ability. She doesn't fill silence out of discomfort. She waits until the other person is ready. I always found that irritating in normal situations. That night it was the only thing that kept me from hanging up. I said, "I need you to come." She asked where I was. I said I was home. There was a pause. She was processing the fact that I'd asked her to stay away from Birchwood, and was now asking the opposite without explanation. Ruth didn't ask about that. She said she'd leave in 15 minutes. I sat at the table waiting, with every light in the apartment on, which I don't normally do because I conserve energy out of professional habit, and because too much light makes me restless. That night I wanted to see every corner of every room without having to turn my head. I didn't hear anything more from the utility area. The silence was the kind you monitor. Not the neutral silence of a quiet house, but the silence of something that has stopped, that is stopped, that may or may not stay stopped. I knew the difference. I'd learned to know it over the past few weeks in a way I hadn't asked to learn. Ruth arrived in 19 minutes. I heard her car in the front lot, heard her footsteps on the stone path, heard the specific knock she gives the door. 2 quick, 1 slow, a habit of hers going back forever that we'd never discussed, but that I would recognize anywhere. I opened the door before she finished knocking. She came in and looked at me for a second, really looked, the way people do when they're taking inventory, and then closed the door behind her and said, "Tell me what happened." It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement that there was something to be told, and that she was ready to hear it. We sat at the table. I told her everything. I started with the night of the fight, with the dinner for one, with the smoked sausage I'd thrown out days later. I told her about the mark on the fence board, the marks in the snow, the shadow, the basement, the breathing, the silhouette in Dennis's apartment that wasn't Dennis, the open door with the intact padlock on the ground. I told her what I'd seen in the utility area less than an hour before. Ruth listened to all of it without interrupting. She has a quality of attention that very few people have. She doesn't finish your sentences, doesn't signal that she's understood before you're done. She stays quiet and listens, and when you finish, she's already processed most of it. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she asked if I'd slept in my car in the Perkins parking lot. I said yes. She said, "Diane." With that weight again, I said I knew that it had been stupid, that I'd tried to handle it alone for longer than made sense. Ruth didn't say I should have called sooner, should have asked for help sooner. She knows when that conversation is useful and when it isn't. She got up, went to the sink, filled a glass of water, and set it in front of me as if I'd forget to drink if she didn't do that, which was probably true. I asked what she thought it was. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said she couldn't name it, that the description I'd given didn't fit anything she knew, and that it didn't matter as much as the fact that it was actually happening, and that I'd been alone for weeks in an apartment with that thing moving around outside. And inside, I corrected. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them and said, "You can't stay here." I said I knew, but there was something I needed to do before leaving. There was something I'd left in the basement. The box with the important documents, the one I hadn't grabbed the night I fled to my car. Birth certificate, car title, a folder with employment contracts I needed for a bureaucratic issue that had been pending for months. All technically replaceable, every one of them, but they'd take weeks and money and processes I didn't want to deal with. Ruth said to leave the documents for later. I said yes. But I stayed sitting at the table instead of getting up and starting to pack what I'd take. Ruth knows me well enough to know that when I go still like that, I'm still running a calculation. She asked what I was thinking. I said I was thinking that it had disappeared after hitting the door, that I hadn't heard anything more, that the utility area had been quiet for over an hour, and that its pattern was nighttime approach with retreat before dawn. That if there was a moment with any margin of safety, it was now, with Ruth here, with light, with the sound of human presence in the apartment. Ruth said, "No." I said I knew. She said it again. "Diane, no." I looked at her. I had missed that face in a way the stupid argument and the period at the end of the text had obscured for weeks, and I thought it was a strange moment for that to become clear. Sitting at the table at 10 at night after telling her about something that had spent weeks circling me while I stayed silent. I said, "Stay here. I'll be 10 minutes, just getting the box." Ruth said she was coming with me. I said no, that I needed her to stay at the front door with the car running, and that if I didn't come back in 15 minutes, she should leave and call 911 from inside the car with the doors locked. She didn't like that. She looked at me with that expression she has when she's weighing whether to give in or hold her ground. She gave in. She said 15 minutes. I put on the headlamp, left the pepper spray on the table. I'd learned from last time how much good it did. I picked up the flathead screwdriver that was still on the kitchen counter from the night of the heater. Not entirely sure why. Maybe just because it was something solid to hold. I went to the back door, opened it slowly. The cold came in. The yard was quiet. The utility area was quiet. The basement door was shut the way I'd left it. I crossed the yard fast without stopping to check anything. Went down the stairs. Opened the basement door. The smell was there but different. Weaker, older, like a trace and not a presence. I swept the space with the headlamp, empty. I went to the far corner where the box was, picked it up, went back to the stairs. On the third step, on my third try going up, the headlamp died. Battery. Same as the other flashlight on the other night at the worst possible moment, which made me think in a completely stupid way that of all people I should know to check the charge before using equipment. I stood completely still in total darkness for 1 second. Then I climbed the last 2 steps blind, hand on the concrete wall, came out into the yard and didn't look back. Ruth was at the back door when I got there. She had come down into the yard without being asked, stayed close enough to act if she needed to. She had abandoned her post at the front, the whole plan, because she knew me well enough to know I might take longer than I'd promised. I didn't say anything about that. She just stepped aside to let me in. We went inside. I locked up. She took the box from my hands without asking. Half an hour later, I was in her car with a backpack, the document box on the back seat, and birchwood falling away through the window. I didn't look back. I should have looked. I don't know why I think that now, but I do. As if there was something I needed to see and missed the chance because I was looking forward too hard. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Ruth turned on the car heater without asking if I was cold. I was freezing. I stayed 3 weeks in Ruth's apartment. She has a guest room she uses as an office, with a twin bed pushed against the wall and a desk buried in papers she moved aside without complaint. I slept in that bed with the door half open and the hallway light on, which she never mentioned, which was kinder than I deserved. The first week I didn't go back to Birchwood. I texted the property manager saying I needed to break the lease with 30 days' notice, that I had an urgent family situation, that I'd be picking up my things in stages. The manager replied with the standard termination form and a note saying they were sorry to see me go after so many years. I replied that I was too. I wasn't, or I was in a way so mixed up with something else that I couldn't separate them. The second week I went back twice, always during the day, always with Ruth waiting outside in the car. I took clothes, took my work equipment, took the coffee maker I'd been given as a gift years ago and was too good to leave behind. The apartment was intact, silent, with that smell of a closed-up place that builds fast in winter when the heat is turned down low. I didn't go down to the basement. I didn't look at the basement door when I crossed the yard. I kept my eyes in the direction I was heading and kept moving. Gary found out something. Not everything, but something. Because in the third week he showed up at work with a bottle of scotch he keeps for specific occasions and set it on my workbench without a word. I drank 2 fingers on my lunch break, which I never do on a work day, and he pretended not to notice. With Ruth, things became different. They became better, which is the right word, but feels too small for what it was. Not in a dramatic way. There was no long conversation about what had been and what could be. It was more gradual, more everyday. She had a way of occupying the same space as me without demanding anything from it, and I relearned what that was like, how I'd forgotten it could be that way. One night, maybe 2 weeks after I'd arrived, she asked if I thought it had gone away. I sat with the question for a moment. I said I didn't know, that its pattern had been one of staying. It had stayed, had learned, had adjusted, that there was nothing I had done that suggested it had any reason to leave, but that there was also nothing I knew about how it worked that let me say the opposite with certainty. Ruth said, "But it didn't follow you, that was true." 3 weeks in her apartment in the center of Hardwick, 7 blocks from Birchwood, and nothing. No out-of-place sounds. No shadow in her yard, which was small and well lit by the streetlight. No marks on any surface. I said no, it hadn't followed me. But as I said it, I thought about something I didn't say to Ruth. I thought about the night she'd come to Birchwood and stood at the back door while I got the box from the basement. I thought about how long she'd stood in the yard, in the dark, waiting. I thought about the smell that night had in the air, and about how it had shown repeatedly, that it could identify presence at a distance I had no way to measure. I didn't say that to Ruth. I had reasons that seemed reasonable to me. She was fine. Nothing had happened, and saying it would be planting a fear with no concrete evidence it was warranted. But honesty requires this. There was also a smaller, less reasonable part of me that simply didn't want to see the expression she would make. That didn't want to carry one more thing I had let happen. On the last day of the 30-day notice period, I went to Birchwood for the final walkthrough with the property manager. It was a Thursday morning, overcast, that March cold that can't decide whether it's going to snow or not. The manager was a woman named Patrice, early 50s. Efficient and impersonal, the way people who handle lease terminations all day long end up becoming. We went through the apartment together. Kitchen, living room, bedroom, bathroom. She noted the condition of each room, checked the walls, tested the faucets. Then she said we needed to check the basement. She said I had left some items down there that were listed in the original inventory, and that we needed to confirm their condition. I went down the stairs behind her. The smell had changed. It was no longer that dense, organic smell from the past few weeks. It was just mildew, just cold metal, the normal winter basement smell I'd known for 11 years. Patrice didn't react to anything, which suggested she wasn't picking up anything out of the ordinary. The boxes I'd left were in place. The heater was running. Someone had fixed it, presumably the building maintenance crew at some point over the past few weeks. Patrice checked the inventory, made her notes, said everything looked to be in order. We went up. She locked the new padlock they'd installed. We signed the paperwork on the front sidewalk because the management office was in her own home, and she preferred to handle it right there. Patrice wished me luck, kept her copy, and left. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Birchwood was quiet. The other units had that look of contained life that residential buildings have during the day when the residents are at work. Dennis's window on the second floor had the shade down the way it always did in the mornings. I went to the car. Before I opened the door, I looked sideways for no specific reason, out of that lateral instinct you develop after spending weeks monitoring what's outside your direct line of sight. There was a mark on the side of the car. Not a parking lot scrape. I knew what those looked like. I had a few. This was a pressure mark, the same kind I'd seen on the fence board on the second day, on the edge of the basement stairwell. A wide pressure, applied top-down on the roof of the car, on the driver's side. I stood there looking at it with my keys in my hand. The mark was new. The car had been parked in front of Birchwood for less than 40 minutes while I did the walkthrough. I got in, locked the doors, started the engine. I drove to Ruth's apartment without stopping, went up, went inside. She was working at the desk and looked up when I came in and saw something in my face because she stopped typing. She asked what had happened. I didn't answer right away. I went to the window that faces the street and looked down. Ruth's car was in her spot next to mine. The street was quiet. Nobody on the sidewalk. Ruth said my name. I turned around. She was standing in the middle of the room with that expression I'd learned to read over years of knowing her. Not panic, but the antechamber of panic, The moment before when a person is still trying to decide if what they're seeing is what they're seeing. I asked when she'd last gone outside. She said she hadn't, that she'd been home all day working, that the car had been in the spot since the night before. I went back to the window and looked at her car. From the third floor, with the morning light coming from the right angle, I could see the roof. There was a mark there, too. Not as deep as the one on my car, not as wide, but it was the same type of pressure, applied top-down, as if something had rested its weight on the roof and stayed still long enough to leave the metal slightly bowed. Ruth came to the window slowly, stopped beside me. She didn't ask anything more. From up there, both cars looked motionless and ordinary, parked side by side on a clean morning street. Hers since the night before, mine for less than 10 minutes. That's when I understood that maybe it had never followed me to Ruth at all. Maybe it had been waiting for Ruth to come to me, not because I had brought her to it, but because maybe it had known about her before it knew about me. Maybe I had never been the primary target. Maybe I had just been the door that guilt had left open. I started to understand that when I noticed how strange she'd become after those days of not returning my calls. Strange in the way of someone who had seen something they shouldn't have seen. Something that shouldn't exist. And only now is it all starting to make sense.